The PFL Show, the podcast dedicated to the Professional Fighters League. I'm your host, John Franklin. I am joined this week by a man who wears a lot of hats, Nolan King. He works for us over at MMA Today. He also works for Tapology and a lot of other outlets as well. Nolan, how you doing?
Doing well, man. I can't complain. Just winding down here on the weekend, and solid weekend of fights, and I'm sure we'll be getting into one of those nights here shortly.
Absolutely. All right, so let's set up this inaugural event for the PFL a little bit. The World Series of Fighting has rebranded itself into the Professional Fighters League. Their league, in their own words, is in a reimagining of MMA, a phrase I was in many ways skeptical about when I first heard it, but I have to admit, after this first show, I'm significantly more intrigued by it. The gist of what they are doing is a regular season, a postseason, and a championship in each weight class. Fighters accrue points to qualify for the playoff and then fight to determine the champion in each weight class, each of which will be given $1 million. So before we get into it, Nolan, you and I talked about this on the scrum, really when it was sort of in its infancy, like it just had been released, and we kind of talked about it. Talk to me about how you felt about it before the card and how you feel about it now.
Well, I mean, I think since the idea was conceived and it was made public, my initial impression was like, oh no, this is going to be another venture for World Series of Fighting where they're kind of struggling. They seem like they don't have any luck on their side. This is going to be a long shot. The idea of a tournament, a league where you have to have these fighters not get hurt. You have to maintain a roster and consistency among the fighters and who you're matching up with who, just seemed like a bad idea to me. And then when they announced the extension, where at the beginning of this year it was supposed to start, and then all of a sudden it was starting in June. And that to me was just like, oh no, this is not a good sign. But I feel like that extra 6 months really helped them quite a bit. Looking at the roster that they've got, it's quite extensive. There's a lot of good names there. It's very deep. You can argue that it's even deeper than some of the other UFC competitors like Bellator. I think this roster, from top to bottom on every single division, it seems like there's really good names. And after seeing the event the other night, I think that this is something that could be viable. And I think that people in general are more excited about it. I think that the event was a success for them, even though they had a major name fall off. And overall, man, I think that my enthusiasm and my belief in them had hit rock bottom, and now it's starting to move back up. And it's now I'm excited. I can't wait for their next event, and we'll get into talking about this one. But I thought it was a really good show.
I did as well, and here's kind of what intrigues me, and I don't want to sort of spoil what I want to talk about sort of mid-podcast or end of podcast in this, but the whole idea of the point system is really fascinating me because it could be good and it could be bad, and I want to talk to you about this because basically the point system means that it doesn't really matter where you appear on the card because the first guy can get a full 6 points, and then the main event could get none, in theory. The winner or the loser of it. And the main event winner would only get 3. So you could be the first guy to appear that night and then end the night leading in points, which is very interesting. Not to mention the fact that as the night progresses and you are fighting on the same card as guys in your same weight class, it becomes more apparent to you that you need to fight a certain way because other guys have already scored a certain number of points. Right? I did not foresee that before the card started. So do you think that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing for them?
I think it's a great thing. Their one of their catchphrases for the season was something. I forget exactly what it said, but it was something along the lines of there are no prelims or something like that, where every single one of these fights matters. The first fight, like you said, matters as much as the last fight. We saw there was a post-lim this week that was aired online, and that the fighter that won that fight is tied for first place in the heavyweight division now. So it definitely makes their it be an event where you sit down and you watch the whole card because everything equals each other. And I think the good thing about this is in terms of it's almost like the Contender Series with the UFC, where it kind of puts that extra little bit of pressure on these fighters to go out there and really fight, really try to put on a finish to get those 6 points. Get the fighter out of there as quickly as possible. But at the same time, it still allows for these fighters that have, more wrestling-based, grinding styles to still be able to get their fair share of points and to be able to, still get on the board and still be able to make the playoffs once they happen.
Right, I agree. Okay, so let's get to the first card, PFL 1. It featured heavyweights and featherweights. If this continues this way, I like it. That way, should there be any fighters who fall out from injury, you can just sort of slide another fighter in there and then maybe make it up later in the season. Okay, before we get to the individual fights, let's talk about the point system. We touched on it a little bit, pretty simple. 3 points for a win. You get additional points based on the fight ending early. So a first round stoppage gets you an extra 3 points, a second round 2 points, and third round 3 points. And if it goes to decision, you just get your win point total, which would be 3. All right, so let's start with the heavyweight division. The performances that jumped out in this one to me were certainly Alex Nicholson, Jack May, and Kelvin Tiller. Let's start with Nicholson. Nicholson threw a flying knee at Jake Hune, which was about as surprising as an unplanned pregnancy, and knocked his ass straight into La La Land. Hune had previously fought at light heavyweight and has spent a lot of his time training in Thailand recently. It showed. I mean, he was throwing the leg kicks early. He looked good. He was moving well and even had a knockdown in the first. Then Nicholson changed all that. The finish came in the second round, earning Nicholson 5 points for the victory. So right out, again, this one jumped out to me because one, Nicholson in the post fight really looked like a guy that they can market well. Had a lot of personality. Obviously, he's got the Spartan thing going for him. Anything more to add to that fight that you saw, or is that pretty much uh, sum it up?
I mean, you pretty much hit most of the nails on the head there. I think that the thing with Nicholson, that what he presents to this division is that he's a little bit of an undersized heavyweight, and I think he presents kind of a unique skill set to the heavyweight division where he's he's like a light heavyweight to put on weight. He's got the build. He's kind of lanky, tall, and he's athletic. And I think he's quicker than a lot of these guys too. I think that in the past, since he was cut from the UFC, the few fights that I've seen him in, he was fighting at middleweight in the UFC. Now he's fighting at heavyweight. He fought at light heavyweight a little bit too. But I think that, just like I said, the skill set that he provides for this division is one that not many other fighters do. It's a weird matchup for most guys.
All right, let's get to the post-lim. You were talking about Jack May. He fought another World Series of Fighting vet in Josh Copeland. Now here was my naivete going into this card. I really thought the World Series of Fighting guys were going to be favored in most of this. I mean, they're sort of in with the same company. I had seen a lot of them. I thought that most of them were pretty good fighters. But these guys that were not World Series of Fighting vets, if you will, they came in to really, put themselves on the map. Jack May, another guy. Like I said, he fought Josh Copeland. May was the last fight of the night, serving as a post-lim on the telecast. The leg kick body shot started it, and strikes from the top brought the ref into things. May's victory earned him 6 points. It was a first-round finish. That's the most that can be earned. And then we'll kind of couple May's performance with Kelvin Tillers, who knocked out Shao Alcantara. I mean, he knocked him dead at 334 in the first, stood over him. So now May and Tiller both ended the night with 6 points. Talk about May or Tiller, whoever really jumped out at you.
Yeah, they both did. I think it's kind of like you said, there were these certain expectations that people had about the roster that WSOF was bringing in, especially guys like Josh Copeland and Kyle Alcantara, who were two of their better heavyweights. But this was kind of like the land of misfit toys card, man. I think, Jack May's a guy who has just been having trouble getting fights. He's been having trouble staying healthy. He's had weird circumstances call off some of his fights. He was with Bellator for a little bit. If you look back on his UFC career, quite frankly, the matchups that he had would have been tough for anyone. Sean Jordan and Derek Lewis, those are two tough fights. And the same thing with Kelvin Tiller. I know Kelvin was supposed to fight on Contender Series last season. He ended up getting injured, I believe, and that fight never happened. And then he's just been in limbo since. He tried to get on Contender Series this season. It wasn't really working out. Gets the last-minute call from PFL. And, man, there's some good free agents out there on these regional scenes that just are struggling to get the opportunities. I'm not sure, why that necessarily is, if they're, kind of one foot in the door, one out, or if it's managers, connections, whatever it is. But I think that they're, it shows you that the scouting that PFL did wasn't, they weren't just grabbing these guys randomly because they had fought in big organizations. So I think we should maybe look out for some dark horses going forward in some of these other cards.
Absolutely. All right, let's look at the rest of the heavyweight results. Francimar Barroso defeated Daniel Gallimore. First round stoppage as well as a doctor stoppage with the eye injury. Also, Jared Rochalt defeated Valdrin Streffy. 3-round decision in that one. And then think that's it for the heavyweights. So if we take a look at the standings here at the end of the card, basically, and if I can do this properly, if you're watching Nolan and I on YouTube right now, you should be seeing the heavyweight standings. We got Kelvin Tiller, Francimar Barrosa, Jack May up at the top with 6 points, Alex Nicholson with 5, Jared Rosholt with 3, and everyone else who fought on the night obviously was defeated, so they did not get any points. So now, just as we start off, again, that would not be the way you would think the standings would go going into this. Obviously, typically, you're a guy who's a little bit deeper into this game than most are. So you might have known, you probably were keeping a good eye on the odds. You knew some of these guys from other organizations. But I think that most fans, if they saw the names, would not have sort of thought that's the way the night would have ended. What was the biggest surprise for you, if any, in the heavyweight division?
I think that the Jack May fight was the biggest surprise for me. I could have seen May winning. I've always thought that he was a good heavyweight that kind of, like I said, his opportunities have never really been there, and he's not had much luck. But I think, when I saw he was fighting Josh Copeland, I know Copeland's a very durable fighter. He's a tough guy. And, at the end of his WSOF tenure, he really started getting into good shape. We saw it on Thursday night. Physically, he looks very solid. And for May to just come out there and, there was I know he finished him like towards the end of the round, but the last, couple minutes of the fight was all Jack May. He was tagging him with body shots to the head, and then he hit him with that push kick / body shot hybrid, whatever you want to call it. Hit him right in the liver area, and just, Copeland actually audibly screamed. Like I don't remember how many times I've seen that, and that was just it. So Jack May was kind of my big surprise on that occasion.
All right, let's move over to the featherweight division. Big performances of the night at 145 pounds for Steven Siler, Lance Palmer, and Alexander Almeida. This was interesting for me because this fight actually featured 3 World Series of Fighting champions, Andre Harrison, Lance Palmer, and Alexander Almeida. So let's start with Palmer, the 2-time champ of this division. He fought a game opponent in Bekbulat Magomedov. Pretty even first round, although Palmer was clearly winning. Then in the second, Palmer reversed his against the cage position, his back against the cage. And as Magomedov was fighting the takedown, he lost his back to Palmer and was choked out. What really interested me about this fight is Palmer's, he's been around a lot. He's Extreme Couture now, but, he spent some time with Team Alpha Male. He spent some time with Dwayne Ludwig. He is a stud. And the thing that I liked about this fight is while you were watching it and his back was against the cage, he was leaning forward, sort of setting up the reversal. And before you knew it, he's, a 4-time, All-American at Ohio State in wrestling. And he's got the credentials, but he is quick, and he really uses that to his advantage, his quickness. And I saw him sort of leaning, and then when he switched it like that, as quick as he did, and the next thing you know, Magomedov's trying to figure out what the hell happened, and next thing you know, he's got his back. He was fighting the takedown, and Palmer was moving for his back. So I really liked what I saw out of Palmer in this one. It was a second round victory, though. It did earn him 5 points. Did I pretty much hit all points about Palmer? What else did you see? Anything?
Yeah, no, I thought he looked phenomenal. I think that's going to be a good thing that's helping specifically the PFL featherweight division going forward, is that these guys that were belt holders that lost didn't completely fall off. Like, they're still very elite fighters. Palmer, Almeida, and Harrison all kind of have they're intertwined in their records and who beat who. And I think it's good that none of them have been kind of edged out, where they're still elite fighters. You'd still be interested in a rematch. You still don't think that necessarily, as good as Andre Harrison is, he's kind of the favorite, I think, in that division right now. I don't necessarily see, just because he beat Lance Palmer, would I not want to see that rematch? I'd be still into that. That would be one of the best fights that they could put on. So I think that him winning is very helpful for people getting excited going forward, because it keeps him relevant at the top of this division.
Right. Okay. And so let's move on to Alexander Almeida. Again, like you said, he's got a history with Palmer. He took the belt somewhat controversially. I was actually there that night, from Lance Palmer. So he fought a Muay Thai fighter in Lee Colville, and he really did what you'd expect him to do. He took Colville down and ripped his arm for a submission victory in the first round. The win earned him 6 points on the night, puts him in the driver's seat moving forward. I just thought that, it looked like you had a a lion in the. I mean, Colville just was in the wrong. I mean, if they were going to fight a stand-up fight, Colville might have been able to hang, but Almeida made sure that was not going to happen very early on. Correct?
Yeah, I agree. There weren't many fights that on paper I was kind of a little like decisive on, that I would be like, oh, I'm pretty sure I know who's going to win this one. This was the only one in the tournament where I really thought it was a mismatch. I don't know much about Lee. I couldn't really speak to his credentials before this, but I just think the age and the experience factors were pretty obvious there for as long as the fight lasted. So it'll be interesting to see Lee in another outing down the road, if he's still competing, if he's not hurt, whatever. But I excuse me. I think that this was kind of a much easier matchup than the one that Lance Palmer had to say. So we'll see what happens. But that was Almeida's really good. I think he's fairly underrated, especially when he's not a huge name. You know what I mean? He doesn't have the name recognition that Palmer has or Harrison has, but he's very, very good. And he's somebody that should be circled on everybody's scouting report for this tournament going forward.
Absolutely. The other 6-point fight of the night was Steven Siler against Magomed Idrisov. And honestly, you can make a case that Idrisov should be the one with the 6 points today. He had Siler on the ropes and was striking from the top, looking like he was going to end it. The ref gave Siler the benefit of the doubt. And to his credit, the kid came all the way back to find a triangle choke. And Nolan, this all happened in the first round. So this was a really, really interesting fight. And it goes to show you that there are some sort of intangibles or things that you can't control in a fight that, again, if you're Idrisov, I don't know what you're thinking today. You fought a phenomenal fight, one that probably should have been stopped, and now you have 0 points. So, again, you fight until the ref pulls you off the guy. So what did you see in this fight? Did you think it should have been stopped? Did you think – I mean, obviously Siler had more because he came back and won. But what did you see?
Yeah, it was a weird situation because I believe it was Keith Peterson that was reffing this fight. And I find him to be a very good referee. I think he's one of the best referees there is out there. But this was an example of just unfortunate timing, I think, on everyone's part, where Siler did go out, or kind of was out of it, where I think if you had a magic button where you could press pause and stop a fight, that would be the time you would stop it. But, unfortunately for Keith Peterson, he's not superhuman. And by the time he would react to be able to even step in there, Siler was already bouncing back. He was grabbing, he was trying to do stuff. So it was one of those instances where, he should theoretically, the state that Siler was in would merit stopping a fight, but he also rebounded so quickly that I don't think Peterson could have stepped in there that quickly. But what he did do, so what Siler did end up doing is quite amazing. I think that comeback was one of the best comebacks I've seen this year in any promotion, and that was just a phenomenal show of heart by Steven Siler. And it's going to be so frustrating for his opponent there, because that was just a absolute about as close as you can get to stopping a fight without stopping it.
All right, as we take a look at the rest of the results for the featherweight division, this is where this really gets interesting to me, this tournament and this point system and all that. So we'll start with Nazareno Malagari and Marcus Galval. Malagari got the win. It was a unanimous decision, obviously, if we're talking about it now. 3 rounds. That gets him 3 points. I want to move on to Timur Valiev, Max Koga, and then Andre Harrison and Juma Turkshin. I think I'm saying that correctly. This is why this is interesting to me. You could make a case that Timur Valiev and Max Koga was one of the best fights of the night, but it goes the distance, and the result of that is only 3 points. Also, Andre Harrison, like you said, being the favorite in this scenario, in this division, in this tournament, only getting 3 points. Clearly dominant performance, just could not find the finish. So that's why I find this intriguing. Now he is, and we'll take a look at the standings here in a second, but these 2 fighters who are 2 of the better fighters in the division, Valiev and Harrison, now find themselves at 3 points with a 3-point disadvantage. So the guys who got 6 points tonight only have to get decisions the rest of the way. And they're, at some point, Valiev and Harrison would have to catch up, is my point. They'd have to fight a strategy that allowed them to get finishes, or they'd have to go for them, if you will. So that's what I think intrigues me about this, right?
Yeah, like you said, there's a lot of, strategy that's going into this, where we've never seen anything like this before, where fighters can go into fights and say, hey, I need a finish in the first round here, or hey, I need a decision if I want to keep going on, or if I want to play it safe. You know what I mean? So it's a very interesting concept where I don't even know if I'd have to sit back and think about this for a while and just kind of wrap my head around it, because on one hand, I do really like the idea of it. It's fresh. It adds a whole new element to this game, and it puts pressure on fighters to put on the best performances that they can possibly put on. But on the other hand, is it gonna, uh, edge out these guys that maybe bring the more, grinding style fights to MMA, which I think that you need those type of styles for it to be MMA. There's a reason why, when one of these fights happens where everybody's like, oh, this is a really boring fight. This guy, Jared Rochel's just holding down Estrefi the whole time they're fighting. That's true. Like, it's not the most visually appealing thing to watch, but on the other hand, you need those type of fights in order for it to be MMA. Like, he needs to have takedown defense. If he went into a fight and didn't need takedown defense, he probably wouldn't be fighting MMA. So for me, it's just kind of an interesting thing, like, to wrap my head around whether or not, the tournament format is the best that I think it can be. But I think they've done a good job, and I have an open mind going forward, and I'm interested to see, how this plays out, especially when it gets to the playoffs and things like that.
Well, and again, I don't know the complete ins and outs of this. My assumption is that once they get to the playoffs, it's head-to-head, right? Which makes
Yeah.
sense.
I should say crunch time. I'm interested to see how it goes when it gets to crunch time.
Right. Now, here's where it becomes interesting. Let's say you take two fighters, and I'm going to transition. We'll look at the featherweight standings, and we'll talk a little bit about what you talked about, how the intertwining of these fighters, and then we'll talk about PFL2 really briefly and how all this plays together. But an analogy that I would use real quick is if you look at fighters like Donald Cerrone or Joe Lozon, right? And let's say they fought in the same division as GSP in a world where maybe GSP fights at 55 or they fight at 70. GSP had a long string of decisions, right? So now he's having all these decisions, but he's the most dominant fighter at 170 pounds. No one can defeat him, but yet he would be accruing 3 points for all these victories, while guys like Lozon and Cerrone, who in a fight with GSP would probably not beat him, but yet they're outpointing him. So I guess the wrinkle in it that really makes sense is that it would be head-to-head at some point. That way a guy like GSP who gets into the playoffs can then defeat fighters in a traditional sense once he gets into the playoffs. So that, for me, I think kind of brings it a little bit closer to home. Now, the other part of it I want to talk to you about is this. We talk about Alexander Almeida, we talk about Lance Palmer and Andre Harrison and their histories with one another. And now, and we'll transition. Well, real quick, let's take a look at the featherweight standings, just to get that out of the way, and then because I'm going to talk about the Harrison, Palmer, Almeida thing and transition into PFL2. So the featherweight standings up at the very top is Alexander Almeida with 6 points. Tied with him is Steven Seiler with 6 points. Lance Palmer has 5. Andre Harrison, Timur Valiev, and Nazareno Malagari all have 3. So again, 2 of the better fighters in the division are now 2 and 3 points away from the lead of the division. So here's where I want to transition into the part that you talked about that makes it interesting. How they are going to match these fighters up, because there's 2 things that you have to keep in mind. One, you want your best fighters to be in the playoffs and in the championship, but you still have to draw eyes to these cards, because not everybody that's going to tune into this is tuning in merely for the novelty of points. Right? So you have to build a card where like on this card, you could have put Lance Palmer against Almeida, but then you run the risk of one of them not making the playoffs because someone has to lose. Right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of the other flaw in the system a little bit, is that these regular season matchups are kind of being picked quite randomly. Like, I think Andre Harrison, like I said, is probably my favorite in the featherweight division. And he was fighting one of, I think, the guys that I would have ranked towards the bottom if I were to do my power rankings of who's in the, in this division. Whereas Lance Palmer got a very tough matchup right off the bat. So, I'm curious to see if they're going to try to make these matchups, the second matchup have some type of reflection on the first matchup in terms of, like, I don't know if they did any type of seeding or scouting or whatever you want to call it, but I'll be interested to see, is Lance Palmer going to get Alexander Almeida yet, or is he going to get somebody that's 0-1, that didn't win their first fight? So I think that kind of has a big bearing on it. Maybe if they had more time for a regular season, if they had done that full year they were expecting to do, they would have been able to maybe make it a little bit more, have a little bit more, rhythm behind their madness, here where they would have some type of system where your regular season matchups were, picked in a certain manner. So that's the only kind of other flaw that I see with the whole thing. But if it's done randomly and like you said, they still have to make these matchups somewhat promotable, put on main events that people want to see, that people will tune in for. So that's just that's an interesting area too that I'm interested to explore going forward.
Which brings us to PFL 2. So PFL 2 is going to be light heavyweights and lightweights. The main event of this card is Luis Firmino against Will Brooks. Now, Luis Firmino, anybody knows about him, he is he's a stud. I mean, he put out some really good fights for the World Series of Fighting. Obviously, Will Brooks is a stud as well. So that's a main event, maybe not in another organization, but for the PFL, it's a reasonable main event. Obviously, there's not that name recognition that's going to draw in casuals, but it's going to be a good fight. Chris Wade draws Natan Schulte, Rashad Magomedov, Jason Heides, another good fight at 55. Brian Foster, Ramsey Nijam. I would pick Brian Foster there, but it's going to be a decent fight. Ronnie Marks and Sean O'Connell, that's not a bad fight. Shmeliano Rama and Brandon Halsey, that's not a bad fight. So it's a mixture. It's a mixture of, okay, we got to put guys that we want to move on and that we're trying to get sort of, with a wink in our eye to the playoffs, and then also having a card that's promotable. So it's a balance there, right? Do you think that, like you said, with the benefit of the year, it might have been a lot easier? What do you think, again, we talked about this in the scrum, if they had their way, how would things go? Do you think that they were expecting the guy to win this, to fight 3-4 times a year? Like if they went with the year, right, that guy would have fought 4 times, 2 sort of point-based fights, the playoffs, and then the championship? Is that kind of what they were thinking, you think?
I'm not sure, man. That's actually a good question, because I look at the schedule that we have now and the 6 months that we have ahead of us for this season 1, and I do feel like it's a little bit crammed still. There's just some margin for guys to get put on medical suspensions, even if they win, that is a little concerning, especially towards the playoffs. But maybe I'm assuming they would have obviously had at least one more regular season fight if they had the full year, maybe if not 2, which again, that brings you up to, a handful of fights per year that you can't rely on these guys walking away healthy every time. But yeah, I think that, it would be interesting. Again, it will be interesting to see if and when they get to season 2, how that plays out. But with the card, the hand that we're dealt right now, I think, especially looking at this PFL 2 card, I think that the matchups are, pretty solid. I thought that about the first one too. There weren't a whole lot of mismatches. There were a couple, I thought, in my opinion, but you're going to run into that when you're in this type of a format. But I'm excited about this next card, man. Just looking it over right now, refreshing my memory, and it looks pretty decent. I'm a big fan. There's a lot of names that I think even non-PFL fans, strictly UFC fans or casual MMA fans would recognize, which is a big solid for them. Kayla Harrison making her debut too, kind of off the tournament, but that'll make things interesting as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, whenever you do something like this, everyone's always going to try and game it. Everyone's going to try and figure it out. The fighters, of course, are going to try and figure it out. So, like you said, the question becomes, do I go in there and try and get a finish so that I am have more time to recover? Because you get into these wars, Nolan, and then now you won a 3-round decision. It was a war. You get 3 points for going to war with some guy, and you got to kind of figure out the upside. So if you're going there to get finishes, you're going to leave yourself more susceptible to get finished, take more risk, take more chances. So I think that once the guys start to go through this, just how you and we've watched one card, and we're starting to kind of process it. These guys are sitting around. I mean, this is their livelihood, so they're sitting around trying to figure out their ways to sort of game the system and figure things out as well. So
exactly.
that's what fascinates me.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. The only thing I can kind of relate it to as an outsider would be the Contender Series from last year, but it was a little bit different because, obviously these guys are fighting. This is a long-term thing where they have multiple fights, a little more strategy involved there. But I think looking at the Contender Series last year, we went into it with almost no information. We didn't know how many guys were going to get signed off each card, what exactly Dana White and the matchmakers were looking for to get these fighters signed. But I think after 8 episodes or so, we started to kind of see, okay, we get what Dana's looking for. He's kind of looking for dominant fighters or flashy performances, things that are interesting like that. And I think that's the same thing that we gotta kind of move on with these first few events with an open mind, try to see exactly, exactly not only how the system works, but how the fighters fit into it too, and how they adjust and how they mentalities that they go into these fights with.
Well, what fascinates me about it, and we'll wrap it up here, is that there's in fighting, and as in anything, you know, other sports, football, whatever. The reason why playoffs even exist is you have to raise the stakes and you have to create urgency, right? And one of the ways that Dana White has traditionally created urgency is with these fight bonuses. Like, it benefits you to go in there like you're trying to get some shit done, and that's what the fight bonuses do. Now that's an awful lot of money to spend to potentially do that. I don't know if PFL has 150, 200 grand per fight to dedicate just for bonuses. So listen, they're giving out $10 million, so it's not like they're hurting. But my point is that that you have to find new and creative ways to create urgency, and I think that they accomplish that with this. They raise the stakes. These fights matter, and there's a reason to go there and try and knock somebody's head off, not just go for a win. You're going for an impressive win. There's a reason for it. I think, and I'll have to look at the rosters, but a little more closely. But I think the fact that they're including 8 guys. If the entire, and I don't know, is the entire roster, so like have we seen every featherweight that's in this thing or no? Are they gonna have another?
So my understanding is that I'm not really sure about that, because if you look at the heavyweight situation with Sean Jordan, like I'm not sure what they're gonna do with him or his opponent. Neither one of them fought,
Right.
So I'm not really sure what happens. I thought that I read somewhere that the opponent of the person that fell off was supposed to get 3 points or something, but then in the rankings I didn't see that. So I think that there's still some kinks like that are being worked out, and I think there could be injuries, there could be surgeries, there could be some guy retires, things like that. So I think that we'll probably see some new entries mid-season. I would be surprised if at least one of these divisions didn't have a new entry, but that's a good question. Another thing that we have to wait and see what happens.
Well, I guess the reason why I ask is because if we saw all the featherweights that we're not going to see in terms of if they replace a guy, but if this was the 10 that they wanted to fight and these are the standings, then if you're telling me that 8 of them are going to make it to the playoffs, then it's a little bit like, okay, it's not, the stakes aren't as high. Maybe they need to move to 6. And again, like you said, as the seasons go on, if this thing survives and they move into a season 2, they'll start to work that stuff out. But I mean, if you're Andre Harrison and you're only 6 guys get in and you're number 7, your next fight, you got to go in there to make something happen, because you don't want to be the former champion that doesn't even make the playoffs. So I think it gets real interesting as you start to, like you said, fine tune this. They can't know how everything's going to play out in season 1. I don't expect them to. I hope this thing has a chance to sort of go for a while so we can figure it out, and see if there's a lot of people who miss the Bellator tournaments.
Right, exactly. I think every time I go down to Mohegan Sun and do we do the media scrum with Scott Coker after it, every single time we went down, somebody would ask about, is there any thought to do a tournament? So there's still definitely some interest, and it's just a matter of, honestly, a lot of luck, because, we've seen tournaments in MMA that are super exciting, awesome, awesome, just fun spectacles to watch. And then we've seen other ones where, they get destroyed by injuries and there's 2 guys fighting in the main event that neither one of them was even in the tournament, things like that. So I think luck is a big thing, in this. But I want to bring up one more point, if time permits, but something that I just thought of, I heard it on the broadcast. I think I heard somebody say it, and then I never kind of really thought about it again. But, with the fact that there's only, like you said, 10 fighters in each division, or 12 fighters, and if a guy gets a 6-point win, he's pretty much in. I don't, off the top of my head, the math, like that's the equivalent to getting 2 3-point wins where half the roster lost their first matchup. So they need 6 points to even tie you. So for me, like, I don't know. I'm just doing it off my head, but basically what I'm saying is,
you're saying that everyone that lost would have to then get a first-round victory, which
right, exactly. So the chances, if you get a first-round victory, like these guys that have 6 points right now, like they would at a minimum be tied to not be in the tournament. Like they would be, if it was like a 4-place tie or something for the last spot. Like that's, if everybody got 6 somehow, something like that. But I think with a first-round victory, like you pretty much buy your ticket, you punch your ticket in. I'd have to sit down and do the math, but it seems like that to me in my head, that these guys that are sitting with the 6s are going to be in the tournament.
Which gets interesting if you have a first-round victory in your first fight and lose the next 2. It's like, are you still
Exactly.
making you're making the playoffs off a 2-fight losing streak, which is
Right.
interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
But Nolan, that's what makes this whole thing interesting. I mean, the UFC, we sit around in Bellator, we sit around thinking about matchups, right? And who's fighting who, and that's all fine. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a main event, a co-main event. You're going to win, and who the hell knows how that moves you around the rankings based on, this is like you said, there's math involved, and it's more tangible. If I get this victory, it doesn't matter what my name is, it doesn't matter who I am, it doesn't matter how badly they want to see me fight. Now that could be a bad thing too.
Right.
Every year all the NBA teams are going to play, and there's a chance we can get the Pacers and the Spurs in the finals, and no one wants to see that necessarily unless you're a fan of either team. So
Right.
you could end up with the championship in a couple of these divisions being guys that nobody cares about. But then again, that's a great story too. So
Yeah.
I think the one thing that I find most interesting about this, and I'll give you the last word, is that it creates narratives.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And just thinking about it again, like we might come down to watching some of these cards where this guy's in weird situations where they would have to get a second round finish. You know what I mean? Like they're mid fight. If you figure it out mathematically on the last event, like, oh, this guy's down by 4 and he needs 5 to win. Like that's a very interesting scenario too that we're gonna get on. It's not just a black and white where, oh, I need to go out there and have a finish. Like I need to do it by the second round. I need to do it in the first round. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it, man. But I think that the narratives, like you said, are what you need. Kind of narratives and good matchmaking. So it's going to be fair matchmaking. So it's an interesting structure, and I'm totally open to it. And I think that overall, it's been a big W so far for PFL.
I agree, and I think that you just opened up something in my head, which is that the idea of not that the PFL would get necessarily involved from an executive standpoint in trying to affect the outcomes of these fights, but there's that cool moment where a guy goes into his corner at the end of the first round, and his corner man says, "If you do not win in this first round, you're out of the playoffs." There's something cool about that. It's not like when they go in and they go, "Hey, listen, man, we're tied on the cards, and you need the third round," because every coach says that, and it may or may not be true, and the fighter may or may not believe it. He may think he's winning, and the coach can say whatever the hell he wants. But if you go into there and the coach says, "Listen, if you don't stop him here, mathematically you're out. You know it, I know it. We talked about it before the fight. You got to go out and get him." That makes this very interesting. So yeah, it's opening up a lot of and the conversations that you and I are having, Nolan, is why they did this. Because
Exactly.
they wanted this to be interesting in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
All right. My thanks to Nolan King. You can tell everybody where they can follow you at and all your outlets and where you can be read.
Sure. So yeah, you guys can follow me on Twitter at MMA_Kings. I'm working. I'll be launching an Instagram, MMA geared Instagram soon. I work, I've been putting in my work for MMA Today per usual. I got a bunch of Contender Series interviews coming up, getting ready for the card on Tuesday. And then also I've been cranking out my prospect reports and my fight announcement rundowns and some other things. Some newer things are going to be in the works soon for Flow Combat. You can also find me doing some live event coverage for MMA Brazil. And then I also recently just joined Tapology. I'll be working with them on their database and their live event coverage. So yeah, man, those are the big 4 as of right now. And thanks for having me on, John. I appreciate it. I always love chatting with you, and I'm sure we'll be talking again on one of the many great podcasts that you do.
Well, he's a man of a lot of hats, and I'm going to throw one more thing at you just to think about until next time we talk. I will, of course, be doing a podcast for Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series. I have no idea what to call it, so if you can think of a title for me, please let me know. All right, that does it for the first episode of the PFL Show on the MMA Today Podcast Network. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at MMA Today Pods. Subscribe on YouTube for all MMA Today content. Obviously, follow Nolan, do all his work. I'm John Franklin. We'll see you next time.